Hello and welcome to Water Stories, the podcast. I'm Eve Barro, and this podcast is a production of BioBAT Art Space. As we embark on each episode, we invite you to immerse yourself in exciting discussions that illuminate the vitality of water, echoing the themes explored by the artists featured in our Brooklyn exhibition on show until June 2025. Enjoy! Today we'll be talking with Robertina Šebjanič. Robertina is an artist whose work explores the biological, chemical, geopolitical, and cultural realities of aquatic environments and the impact of humanity on other organisms. Over the years, she has produced numerous works which engage with human impact on and relationship with marine environments. Robertina, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Thank you, Eva, for inviting me. I'm also very excited.
I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the genealogy of your work and what sparked your interest in marine ecology and more than human aquatic life.
There is always these stories about, as a child, I spent lots of time in local river. So I was always curious about all these kind of different animals, which they could be there in the watery environments. And then every summer I spent at the ocean, at the Adriatic Sea, actually, where my favorite thing to do was to just look around at the shores and to meet all these different creatures. So this kind of love stayed with me. And then later on, I was like always deciding between this, shall I go to study marine biology or go into the arts? Somehow arts win the study process, I would say. But then also as organically and as it goes in life sometimes, both things came together, and I'm really happy, and I can say also privileged that I could join both of my loves into the practice which I work now on, where I incorporate the scientific factual data with the artistic poetic representations, and I'm happy that I can even call this my career now. For the last decade, I'm very focused on that. And yeah, so this is somehow how it started.
That's really interesting how you mentioned that at some point you had to make this choice initially between marine biology and the arts. And I feel like maybe it's something that's common in these spaces where, because of the way like either the educational system is set up, you have to make these choices, but it's amazing that then you could combine them eventually. How was it for you when you realized that, or maybe it was more of a progressive thing, but that you could do both basically, and they could both be as relevant as each other and be combined in that way?
Yes, that honestly, on the beginning, I didn't realize that I managed to merge them with years of development and with projects which they started to be bigger and bigger, like bigger and bigger in the context of the research and collaborations with different people. I realized, yeah, actually, I'm doing the same thing which I wanted to do, just in the different settings and with different points of views, which can be also super nice to questioning specifics of science, but then also explore the different materiality and options which I was entering through arts.
There's something I've also noticed about your practice, but let me know if I'm wrong, in the way that you talk about your work. There seems to be words like, I think, aquaforming and aquatocene that I personally hadn't really heard before. And I've heard people using these words, and I'm wondering if it's part of this, I don't know if hybridization is the right word, but it's this combination of the science and the arts and the poetic approach to like more than human life and maybe more data-oriented approach. I'm wondering if you think there's a need for new words and new glossary and new concepts to be able to evolve in this sort of hybrid space?
I think that's a very good question and very relevant, at least for me. I feel it like that. As form aquatocene, it's a term which I coined, and it's a play of the words of the Anthropocene, the era where the human imprint on the geological kind of representation of our planet is so strong that it like resonates with the whole geological era. That's why this is a term which could be, we could say it's around already for last 50 years. Still, it's not everybody still agrees on it, but I think that it's very important that we are having that conversation. And then, because as humans are more terrestrial creatures, this is the area where we feel much more connected somehow. So this kind of aquatic representations, they can always a bit further from us, in the sense of, mostly when I speak with people about staying at the oceans or rivers or different watery bodies, it's for relaxation, vacation. Of course, it's different for the people living there, for the coastal communities, which can be also very industrial. So bottom line, tourism / relaxation vacations or living next to the ocean was more or less always very industrial from the human perspective. And then also, for instance, talking about the rivers, only 1/3 of the rivers is still free flowing. This means that 2/3 of the rivers, of the whole rivers, which they are like floating in these different areas of our planet, not floating, flowing, they are all constructed or constrained by our constructions. So the water in general, like watery bodies or ocean, seas, rivers, lakes, they're all very industrialized. And this is something which we do forget somehow, because, as I like to say, far from eyes, it's far from heart, and that's the truth. So that's why with the wording of Aquatocene, I really wanted to bring also this awareness of this industrial nature of our usage of water bodies into the conversation. So it started as a sound artwork. Aquatocene is actually the name of one of my projects where I refer to the underwater noise pollution, the pollution which is mostly like coming from us human-related technologies. This means like when we drive with the boats or put into the water bodies big wind turbines or stuff like this. Like all this industrial usage of the oceans is also resonating there. And because of the nature of the ocean and the nature of the water and the physics of the water, the sound travels 5 to 7 times wider and stronger in the oceanic atmospheres than in the air. So that's one of the facts, which is how our presence is very easy to sense. If you speak with people which they are diving, everybody will tell you, yes, when you can hear the boat before you see it. And this was the first impression when I started to do this. I went to record with hydrophone. It's a specific underwater microphone which you put into the water and you can listen to the aquatic realness, also the biodiversity and different animals and fish and so on. But sadly, also mostly what I record when I go, especially at the shores in the very busy places, is the human imprint, which is like different motorboats and stuff like that. So this kind of representation with that is into the work framing of Aquatocene. And then because I have one foot in the academia also, so I do spend quite some time also with lecturing at University in Nova Gorica and also in Aalborg University in Denmark, but as well also doing lots of guest lecturing in different universities. I started to write also academic articles, and one of the articles somehow came into the hands from scientists from University from Taiwan. They contacted me online if they can use my frame of Aquatocene for their scientific research. So this was like something which I am very proud of, because, and also very humbled, because mostly when I'm working between art science, I was the one going there and being the one who started the conversations. But lately I see that this conversation is like opening up also from the scientific community. So there is more and more scientists also coming to the artistic or creative people or to the culture to reframe their scientific kind of knowledge, which for me, to have this exchange is also great because it gives me also other perspectives and options to rethink and think the challenges which we are facing in the topics which we are opening up.
Maybe that resonates also with the approach we have to take to the environment and our relationship with the environment, which has to be interdisciplinary, because yeah, I think like it's topics that affect so many areas of life and there's so many different angles through which we can look at things. I'd love to go back to the underwater noise pollution, because I think I never really thought about underwater noise pollution, as you said, because I feel like water is not an environment in which humans are very comfortable, or they don't spend a lot of time there. And I wonder how that affects our relationship with the modern human life in the water, because I know that in your work you collaborate with a lot of different species and a lot of different ecosystems. So yeah, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on what happens when you shift your attention to water in terms of your relationship with the inhabitants of this water.
Yeah, that's really something which is crucial. And this is also, I think, how my whole body of the work started to shape into that, as you mentioned before, that this moment of realization, I'm actually doing the research which I wanted to do, but just it's angles which we are shifting and we are changing. So with the noise pollution, I started very naively. I went and I bought the hydrophones and I was like, oh, amazing. I will do the field trips and I will listen to all these beautiful creatures and just hear this other atmospheric presentation of the sound which is in the waters. And then, like, when doing that and recording all these different sonic scapes, I was constantly irritated by the sound of the boats or machinery or something which was very near to us. And then I realized that this is like super present in the oceanic realness, that our presence with all these different machinery is much more than just like idea about, oh, maybe there is something. So one of the things with oceans and with water is also that humans, we are visual animals. Visual is like one of the main sensors, and then it's all this other sensory presentation of the things like smell, hearing, and so on, touch. And the oceans, this changes because of physicality of water. So very quick, when you're in 200 meters down in the water, in the ocean, there is already twilight. This means that there is not all the light coming through anymore. And in 1,000 meters, total darkness. So all the animal marine life is working towards that and understanding that their way of communication or talking with each other is mostly through the sound and chemistry. This means that they are giving to each other chemical signals also. And chemistry can be connected then with the smell and with the touch. Because, you know, the pressure, lower we go, bigger the pressure is in the water. So that's why also exploring of the ocean is it's also very expensive, as well as also very challenging, because to reach deeper depths and understand how much pressure some machinery has to be exposed to is important to understand, because otherwise if you drop the sonda or something there down and it's not surviving, that is the same like also gathering the animals from the deepness, from the deep sea. When we bring them up, their shape is changing because they are not adapted to live in the atmospheric pressures of our atmosphere. Because I like to say that we are also walking on the seabed of the atmosphere of the clouds and so on, because just that the air has different density than the water, and these different physicalities are of course shaping and changing behaviors and bodies and way how somebody's in water. It's possible to float in air. There is just specific, only birds and insects figure it out how to do that on some seeds, but you know, the details. But so it's always this different adaptation to different environments. And oceanic is very special with that.
I'm really interested in hearing more about technology and machines, because you mentioned how the physicality of water affects maybe your senses and your ability to perceive some things, maybe as an embodied thing, but also through the machines that you're using. So yeah, I'm interested in the tools that you're using to perceive marine life and how this impacts maybe your relationship or your understanding of this life and these other beings.
So for me, like when I'm using I use a lot of hydrophones and underwater cameras. It's just because this is the easiest how to enter by myself. And then I spend also quite specific amount of time on different boats, especially in science research boats, because there is lots of arts in residency programs. And I was a few times also invited to take part in some specific research boats. Or through this, I was like part of one research which was happening in 2019 at the Northern Atlantic. I was artist in resident on Celtic Explorer, is a science research vessel from the Irish universities. So I was on the board and it was quite a great experience. This was one of the times when I was the first time for 3 weeks together with scientists and different engineers on the boat. And it was amazing to see also which kind of machinery they have been using and technology. The mission was actually to experiment with different non-invasive ways of observation of animals in the coastal regions of Irish waters, which was great because through this I could really talk with all these people on the boat and the scientists. Like it was led by Chris McNulty, like to speak about how to observe and be there without being the disruption for the animal world or for marine life in general. And this was so great because one of my favorite things was when they had been releasing the big RUV. This is like huge underwater robotic operated vehicle where you have camera and different sensors on it, and you can also see different creatures and so on. So when this went into the water, the whole team came together and everybody was just yelling the names of the creatures which we saw in the videos, in the live streaming. And it's such an amazing thing to have this possibility to have this live streaming from deepness, which would not be able to reach with our own bodies. So experience that and also experience and perceive them. And it's also something else when you're there with them working on data. Like I was also helping with some of the tasks during the process. And it's also somehow being part of making this data, which I'm using many times for insight of my artworks, in which they're represented through my visual or audio or smell or different variations. Being next to that and be physically present, I think for me, it also gives me better idea how all that is produced and also how can I then better convey that message inside of the artwork. Because artwork on the end was very poetic. Like I wrote after being in this Northern Atlantic area. And it was organized by Galway 2020, European Capital of Culture. But it was during the COVID times. Of course, the way how we did it, it changed a bit. But in general, I really wanted to work with specific way of singing. There is Irish way of Seanonosh. So I wrote the libretto, which was combination of this kind of scientific data of the findings which we did, plus mythologies. And inside of the work, I also focus on some like cultural emblems in the sense of like how animal can be cultural emblem and how animal change from being industrial to the cultural emblems. But now we are entering Eva already into some other topics. So maybe I just mentioned this, that I just wanted to have also that experience of science, gathering data, but then also infiltrating that into the arts. And it's something which gives me great insights.
I loved how you mentioned how when you started seeing all these creatures, everyone was really excited. And I'd love to hear more about like maybe the emotions that arise when you're able to observe without disturbing, as you said, because I think you mentioned earlier the first time you started paying attention to maybe the acoustic ecology of marine environments, you felt irritated that you could hear humans so much. And then I love how then in this anecdote you mentioned the joy that all the scientists and yourself were feeling when you were able to observe these other creatures. So what's the place for your own emotions and your own excitement towards this ability to observe without disturbing, when I feel like often we feel so much grief towards maybe what humans have been doing to their ecosystem and their environment. So yeah, I'm wondering what's the place for joy and excitement versus maybe irritation sometimes.
I have to say that that's a very good point. And also I like that you're mentioning this eco-anxiety and grief, which comes with looking into these topics, because it isn't easy. Like I will start with the grief and then we will go into the joy, I think. Because being faced with many different situations or data or experimentations where, for instance, we have been working with some colleagues here at the Adriatic Sea. I call it here because this is my local sea, it's Adriatic Sea. It's part of Mediterranean. And I was working with colleagues in Croatia in the city of Dubrovnik at URI Institute with Gino Šutić and some other scientists on pharmaceutical pollutant and how that is changing and shaping bodies of microorganisms, and then also consequently also entering different life cycles and in the end also our bodies. It's similar loop as with microplastics and all these other toxins which we are constantly releasing in our environment. So it isn't easy to talk with that, and it's hard to grasp the huge quantities which they're happening on daily lives. So for me, I call that project, for instance, because we have been recording that and doing experiments in the lab, and then also showing this how microorganisms have been diluted in different quantities of that as a moments of sadness, of how the interaction is going into the wrong ways. And then on the other hand, when I am on this kind of different scientific research vessels or working with scientists with the same environments, it's also great joy to see specific marine organisms. Or I remember when I was on this Celtic Explorer, which I mentioned before, on this boat in Northern Atlantic, and the scientists found for the first time after a while some specific very tiny shell. It's like tiny as your fingernail, but it was huge excitement in the boat because that shell is the one which kind of keeps together because of the glue, which is like making. It's the gluing material for the coral reefs in the deeper seas. And this means that if they are present, that there will be also other creatures coming. And it's a very important, tiny creature that gives this big boost to bigger communities. And it's a great time to be together to explore that also. So going from that grief and then entering to that joy, it's something which I constantly battle with myself also. I think that we are all co-creators of our environment and our world and atmospheres which we are living in. And I'm not saying, I still think that bigger corporations, they should really rethink how they are navigating all that. I know that in the sense of economy and so on, it takes time to change and reshape the world. But if we will not be doing this fast enough, there will be really devastating consequences, which we all experience already now. There is all this data which is showing how the world is getting hotter in some specific regions. There is bigger and bigger natural catastrophes which didn't occur before and so on. So there is physical evidence and also economic evidence. And with this kind of work, which I many times emphasize and try to navigate, is also how to speak about it and how to navigate it and how to support each other inside of that. That's also something which I'm rethinking. And no, I don't have perfect answers on these kind of things. Definitely not.
I think there's something really beautiful that you just said, which is this idea that we are co-creators of our environment, because you just mentioned how, yeah, this really small shell or very small organisms are so fundamental to bigger things. And then maybe like our individual responsibility as individuals, but also in terms of the structures that we're part of, and maybe, yeah, the corporation that we support, or the corporation and what they do themselves. And yeah, really this idea of humans being embedded within these ecosystems, because I feel like in the past there's been this idea that there's humans versus nature, and I think that leads to a lot of the problems that we have. So it's really amazing to maybe decenter, go maybe away from just thinking of like humans at the center of everything and paying more attention to the different communities. You also mentioned community of being with the scientists, being together, but then also with other organisms. I'm wondering if there are certain creatures or organisms that you have felt particularly connected to, because I know you just mentioned the shell. I know that you've worked with a lot of different organisms, so I'm just wondering, especially because maybe you have a particular attachment, you said, to the Adriatic Sea. So I'm just wondering, personally, do you have certain organisms that you felt like you resonated with more, or ecosystems?
It's hard to say that, because marine, it's always exciting for me, or watery, because I was also working with some specific rivers and exploring that area also. And at the same time, maybe we could say it like this, one of the first aquatic creatures that I've worked with intensely have been jellyfish, specifically moon jellyfish, Aurelia aurita. In Latin, they're called like that. And with them, I spent more than 3 years on the research and working on is one of the artworks which kind of shaped me, I would say. It's called Aurelia 1 plus Hertz. And it has 2 variations how it's shown. With the work, I really went into rethinking how the organism, because the jellyfish, when they are pulsating, they actually get, the water comes into their body, goes through the circles of their inner system, and then it's also going out of their bodies. So it's very interesting how they are like taking in and out the system and the environment which they are around with. They're one of the, if you have them at home in aquarium, they're one of the most fragile creatures you can imagine. But then in the evolutionary context of the oceanic vastness, they are one of the most resilient creatures, which is like existing since they are dated back like between 500 to 600 million years. To survive all these different eras and changes of the aquatic levels and chemistry, because there was lots of changes in that levels also, it was fascinating for me. So, and then on the other hand, I really wanted to speak about this, the context of interspecies and multi-species, or what does it mean to cohabitate this planet with this kind of creature that is so foreign to us. Because very easy for us humans is to connect with our mostly furry animals, which they are our, I call it on the pedestal, because we change our opinion about different creatures depending how what is our relationship with them. Our, in the sense of like humans versus more than human. In the sense of the cats and dogs, like the animals which we feel connected with, it's easy to understand, and we like to reflect on them. My dog is so happy when he gets that. I'm not sure the dog is happy. We just decided that this is our way how to perceive that emotion of that animal. Maybe they're in the relationships because like they know that they will get food from us and nowhere else. This codependency can be very weird. But when it started to develop this kind of relationship with wolves and so on, it was also about the protection. So we use them for our security, and we provide for them secure food source. So there's always this kind of economy of interspecies in this context. And there's lots of animals which we domesticated in the sense of to use them in industrial senses. The fact that there is more chicken in the world than that this is one of the main animal, we don't think about it because we don't see them, because they're also part of the farming system. And then on the other hand, there is this kind of creatures like jellies. Mostly people don't like them because there are cultures also which they are using them in their culinary ways. But in general, there is the creatures which they are like complicating our vacations when I want to go to swim into the ocean. And then there's some of them, they are harmful for us, some of them not. But in general, the idea of being surrounded with them is not something which people would like to, in general. Of course, there is always exception in every relationship, I would say. And then I really wanted to bring this kind of creature which is so foreign into the theater or into the gallery space. So this is the only artwork where I actually have live animals instead of the tanks which they're special for care of jellyfish, which I worked with a company which is like actually building these kind of specific tanks to have jellyfish at home as a pet. And always when I show them, I took care that the jellies which I'm showing in the exhibitions are actually coming from the close environments. This means from different aquariums or bigger zoo or something. Because I really don't like the idea to go to catch them and bring, this is something which I don't do. With them and with their pulsation and with their presence, they are actually, when I do performance with them, they are actually working, or part of the sonic field it's connected to their way and partly it's me who performs, and then on the end of the performance I go from the stage. And I like to refer to this artwork with one sentence from Porcelain's poetry: there's still songs to sing beyond humankind. And that's the whole point of that project. It's to, because I think with this kind of, and I think you mentioned about this before, with this kind of relationships between human and more than human or non-human or whatever we call all these kind of systems, is to embrace the idea that not that they are just like giving sounds out there and they're communicating for food or whatever basics, but I think that all these different creatures, either marine or terrestrial or airborne or so on, they're also having their own ways of how their culture or their society is built up. And it's mostly not only one specific species, but it's like interspecies relationships also. Because we speak about, if we go back to the concept of Umwelt from Jakob from Uxkol, is one theoretical biology, which is used a lot also in the context of art science. I think many times we come on his name in this kind of writings. And he spoke in this Umwelt about this kind of bubbles of different interspecies relationships, how they coexist, who is the one who is eating whom, who is the one who is like singing lullabies to whom, and so on. So it goes many different ways.
I think that's so fascinating how you mentioned that sometimes we have certain relationships to other organisms which we used to relate to in very specific ways. You mentioned chickens, you mentioned dogs, and I think it's so interesting what happens when you start rethinking what could be your relationship to creatures that you've always considered as others. As you said, maybe creatures you haven't seen a lot, or creatures you don't know about a lot, or creatures that like you're not used to be in almost like economy with. And yeah, what happens when you spend time together? I think you mentioned this several times, this idea of spending time together And you mentioned it with the jellyfish and maybe co-creating with others, which is so interesting because it might be scientists, or it might be other mythologies, as you mentioned, or it might be other creatures and other ecosystems. And I think that's really, yeah, inspiring to think about. Maybe my last question, and I think it's beautifully leading to this. I'm wondering how you feel about kinship, or like a sense of kinship that would arise from rethinking our relationship with others without expecting necessarily them to be part of a certain economy, but just, yeah, seeing what happens when you spend time together. How does kinship enter this space?
I think it's a very important question about the kinship and how to answer this. I developed a frame which I call empathic strategy. And I use this many times, especially with the workshops at universities or in these master classes, where we try to enter with others also into this. How can we develop this kind of strategy of entering of or resonating with the other without being using it for one of other thing? And it's quite a challenge. Like on the beginning, everybody, yeah, but that's easy. But then you always come to this, so how? And what would be for them getting out of this kind of relationship also? Because many times we ask us how this resonates with us and how we would like to do, but what they are gaining out. And then one of the interesting examples, for instance, I worked on intense research between different evolutionary strains from two animals on two different continents, which somehow, without being related, develop similar base of strategies of surviving in extreme environments. One is the axolotl. It's a Mexican salamander, which is now used also a lot in regenerative medicine, because it's whichever body part of it you cut, it will regrow. And it's very resonating with our human idea of prolonging and enhancing our lives as long as possible, because I think this 21st century is definitely one of the centuries where we will live longer as we do because of all these different enhancements which they're making that possible with the medicine and so on, and also quality of life. Depends also, of course, of geolocation of the world where we live. We should not forget on that. We don't live in the equal world. And all that is also changing through the geopolitical forces very quickly, sadly. And then on the other hand, to rethink how these kind of strategies have been developing these two creatures, because one is the axolotl, another one I forgot to mention is it's a proteus which lives in the Slovenian cave, mostly in caves which they are in Slovenia, Croatia, and Italy. And it was interesting to see, especially if I speak about axolotl, in 1864 they brought them to Europe as in part of this kind of natural colonialistic kind of way of like gathering all the different species from all over the world. And on the beginning, they didn't know what to do with them because they could be thinking, this is the baby of something. But this baby of something never started to be something else. So it was them. So then they figured it out a few decades later that this is actually this creature which has this amazing regenerative possibilities, and they started to use it a lot, and now it's like one of the model organisms in biology. The bizarrity of all this kind of situation is that there is more of them living now in the medical science institutes than in the swamps of Mexico City. Because in swamps of Mexico City, because like living in this kind of watery lake of Xochimilco next to this kind of monstrous mega city, where there is 25 million people living, their living environment is shrinking, and the quality of water is, of course, also plucking and so on. So there's just this, and they're not called different subspecies, but from my perspective, and when I speak with scientists and so on, they tell me, that we could start to think that they are another species than the one which we took from the nature. And this is just one of the examples like that. There was many of them. Oh, they're used in different ways also. And it's also we are like changing their representations. So kinship is a very complex relationship. One thing is definitely with some of the species, and of course different people can have different pets, is this kind of kinships, the companionship, which is like developed, especially with the dogs and horses and cats. Cats, they have their own agenda in that. There is always this joke with that, who domesticated whom. But joke aside, there's always this kind of creatures which we are more comfortable with than the creatures which we don't exactly like their presence, as rats, mice, and so on, like some specific animals which they are benefiting from our urban situations and using that, and there is this constant battle of getting rid of each other. There is many complexities and many stories to tell, I would say, on the end. For instance, basking sharks. It's like second biggest shark, and it's plankton eating. It's huge creature, like more than 20 meters long. In the 17th century, for instance, they have been using it a lot to catch them and make oil lamps from their livers. So in this context, in that time and era, it was industrial animal. Because of their number shrank, and even though this is like migratory species, so it travels different oceans from Atlantic, Pacific, you can find it in different ways. Somehow, for some specific reason, Irish are very connected with them. And because of their numbers have been plummeting, they started to, so they are no species which is not allowed to catch or something. And they started to do this kind of actions, go to paddle and observe the basking shark. And this kind of gives them this specific, it's not exactly companionship, but the way how they're treated is more like a cultural emblem, I would say. And then people go there and observe them, and being in presence of this kind of like majestic creatures is really amazing. When I was on the boat, they have been constantly swimming, or better to say gliding, because they're really gliding on the surface because they're eating plankton, which is the bigger quantities is actually on the surface waters. And it was really great to see that and experience this kind of presence of them. And of course, it's definitely different presence of this kind of creature than the creature which I'm much more used to, or have some strange phobia or anxiety about it and so on. So it can go into so many different ways of thinking of it. But bottom line, I think, is always this, that we as our society, and it's very related to specific geolocations also in the world, we decide for specific animals to give them different ranks somehow. And especially in this kind of empathic strategy workshop, we speak a lot about that, how to go beyond this ranking and how to embrace something which is foreign or unknown or uncomfortable. And also that it's not just like benefiting, how to go beyond to understand each other without just benefiting, but just like to connect with love somehow.
I think that's a perfect way to finish. I think with more questions than we started with, but really nice questions of all the possibilities and all the ways we could relate if we maybe stopped imposing certain frameworks, and if we just wondered what could happen if we just see what happens when we're in relationship to each other, with the most expensive definition of relationship that we can have, because as you said, kinship is such a broad way of relating, and I think it's really beautiful. And thank you so much for this conversation. That was so interesting and so enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva, for all the amazing questions.
Thank you for listening to this episode. We hope you enjoyed it. You can find all of our other episodes online on our platforms, as well as in our listening room in our exhibition space in Brooklyn, New York. Bye!